Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Kapil Sibal, who hardly needs any introduction. He is one of the more articulate faces of the government and also looking after as Union Minister two very key areas, human resource development and communications and IT. Welcome to our show, Mr. Sibal. I would like to open with a broader question as also a concern today, that successive CAG reports have willy-nilly resulted in a situation where past contracts are being revisited, contracts are being cancelled, whether it's in telecom or now in coal, as we see it happening in front of us. The industry has expressed concern. Industry leaders like Deepak Parekh have said that if this goes on, then what sort of signals are we sending on behalf of our economy? How do you look at things that are panning out at the moment?
I think it's an exceptionally serious matter. Serious because the consequences for the economy are so negative and are so enormous that if we continue in this fashion, India may lose its impetus for growth. Yeah. And it is, I think the reason for this is that people have not really understood what quote unquote losses.
Yeah, sure.
Right? When take for example, if you can talk of a concept like presumptive loss, yeah, then surely there is something called presumptive gain.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
So how do you
flip side
how do you assess presumptive loss without calculating presumptive gain?
Yeah.
Let's take telecom, right? You gave the licenses, bundle the spectrum with it at a fee of 1680. Okay? Prices were brought down. Today 90 crore mobile phones there are in the market. The ordinary, the village vendor, the scooter rickshaw wala, the cycle mechanic, maid in the house, they have mobile phones. Commerce, the pace of commerce is quickened. Connectivity is quickened. The fisherman knows where to fish. The agricultural sector, the farmer knows when to sell his product, right? The mother knows when the child is coming home, right? Now, these are all benefits that emerge from a low-cost regime where the entry levels in the sector are low. Now,
that was part of a deliberate government policy.
It has to be. It has to be, because remember, this is transactional. Yeah. In a welfare state, what is the objective of a welfare state? To give goods and services free, yeah, or at a very low price to people because they can't afford them otherwise. Yeah. So if the end objective is affordability, yeah, and low prices, yeah, then you cannot in the transaction with that in end have auctions that will not serve that end purpose. So therefore, low prices may result in what you may call presumptive loss, but it has enormous presumptive gain. So in a balance sheet, you can't calculate the loss without calculating the presumptive gain. And I think that's really the mistake that we've made.
Yeah. But Mr. Sibal, why couldn't the government really articulate this point to the larger masses? I'm sure by experience they would understand what you're trying to say, by their own experience of using the mobile and gaining from it.
No, you take schools. You give land at institutional rate.
Exactly.
If you auction the land, you'll never have a school. If you give it at an institutional rate, yeah, there may be a presumptive loss because you've not auctioned it. But the gain is that there are hundreds of children in school. They get educated. Yeah. Right? Then they have access.
In fact, that's the thought that came to me. If tomorrow, if the CAG were to look at all the land, lakhs and hectares of land given out by state chief ministers for all these purposes and start calculating market prices, then where do you end up? Do you then reverse all those land allocation to private sector, industry, to schools?
There was allocation Raj from 1950 till we dismantled it, the license Raj, right? Everything was given. So then all transactions were corrupt of every government because they were given. At a given point in time, that was the policy. Of course, we changed it. So these are very complex economic issues. And I don't think that institutions which are dealing only with the law and institutions which are dealing with accountancy are fully
Geared to understand the complexity.
geared, and not only geared, have the opportunity to understand the complexity of policy making and the objectives of policy making when their focus is narrow. Whether something is constitutional or not constitutional, or whether something is in accordance with the law and audits, or the law and audits or not. So I think there is a problem there.
In fact, in this context, I would like to draw your attention to what Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Mr. S.H. Kapadia, said in his sesquicentennial speech at the Bombay High Court. He said that the government may have what he described as utilitarian morality, and the higher judiciary may have a morality which is based on jurisprudential principles. So there could be tension, and then he argued that the higher judiciary should not try to answer questions which it cannot, or it is not supposed to, and let the executive and legislature answer those questions.
Precisely what the concept of separation of powers is.
Exactly, and he said there could be chaos if this principle gets violated.
In fact, that
What did you think of his statement, his reference to chaos?
It's an exceptionally thoughtful statement, and his reference to chaos is perfectly valid. Let's take an example as to what has happened in the recent past. In the case of 3G, we had to auction because that was the prescription of the court. Government earned a lot of money. We got 1 lakh crore, right? Sure. But what happened to 3G? No rollout, right? So we have to ask ourselves the question, are national assets, when they are put to public use, are they meant to be sources of revenue to enrich the exchequer, or are national assets to be used to enrich the common man? If it is meant to enrich the exchequer, I'm totally against it, right? And that's where the contradiction is. You had a 3G which enriched us, but it didn't enrich the people of India. You had a 2G where there was presumptive loss, but it enriched the people of India. So I think that we in government have to make that choice, not the judiciary, not the CA and AG.
But the climate is such, Mr. Sibal, that the government is getting sort of pushed into listening to the judiciary. Of course, it has to. When judiciary passes an order that 2G license should be re-auctioned, now obviously you're going to re-auction them, and it'll end in the same kind of result as you just said you don't desire actually.
No, it might. But what do we do? What do we do? If we do not do it, the judiciary will say we are violating their order, right? So in a way, in a sense, the judiciary is now dictating policy to us, right? Now, and that's exactly what the Chief Justice of India was saying, that if the contours, the jurisdictional contours of institutions are, what do we call it? Jurisdictional contours of institutions are breached. I think that's the appropriate word. If they are breached, then the consequences are very serious.
Now we'll discuss this in more detail, but after a small break, please stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a very interesting conversation with Mr. Kapil Sibal on a host of issues that are confronting our economic governance today. In the case of telecom, you yourself went to the Supreme Court in a presidential reference and sought to understand from the court as to what your eminent domain is in the context of telecom, at least. I guess you're trying to seek a clarification.
Well,
Now, was there also aimed at telling the Supreme Court, okay, let's reassess what our respective domains are?
I think, Venu, the matter is sub judice. The judgment is reserved. it would be entirely inappropriate for me to really talk about the reference because the matter is pending in court.
Sure.
And it would be taken amiss if I make any comment. But this much I will say, that we need all of us to rethink. I mean, the judiciary has done enormous good to this country also.
Yeah,
sometimes they have breached their jurisdiction to do a lot of good to this country.
Yeah.
Because if the executive doesn't perform, and if people don't get water, people don't get electricity, things are in a mess, the judiciary actually sometimes sets things in motion, which brings the executive on board and start addressing issues which they haven't addressed.
Sure.
So I think to that extent the judiciary has played a human role.
Often the executive itself has pushed the ball.
Sometimes, yes, it in their court. So this is not meant to criticize the judiciary in any way, but it is meant to put things in perspective. Namely, sometimes it's like self-regulation.
Sure.
You know, the media, for example, has far exceeded its jurisdiction in many areas. Right? But we have not done anything to restrict that freedom because we expect an element of self-regulation, right? And we think that any interference in the freedom of speech will have negative consequences. Similarly, I think the judiciary has to decide for itself what the contours of its jurisdiction are and be exceptionally careful, exercise power where it's necessary to move beyond those contours, restrain from exercising power where they feel that it is impinging on policy which they are not perhaps best suited to decide. And that's something that must be left to the domain of the executive.
Do you think CAG today appears more powerful because there seems to be a rupture within the legislature on any sort of consensus, for instance on the coal issue? Is that the same
No, I think as far as the opposition is concerned, their take on it and their attitude is entirely political. You have the Gujarat election coming, the Himachal election coming. They have a handle in the report of the CAG with which to beat the government with. They will not allow parliament to function.
Sure.
And they think that in the course of this confusion, they may well mislead the people of India. And maybe they'll get some benefit in Gujarat and Himachal. So as far as the opposition is concerned, their agenda is entirely political. My worry is in fact not on that issue, because I think we'll be able to explain it to the people. My worry is that when a leader of a political party says that majorities in government and parliament don't matter. A leader of a political party has said, what's the point of a debate? The UPA is in majority. Right? So we will not allow parliament to function.
That's the argument they're using for saying that PAC is ineffective because...
PAC is ineffective. Parliament may UP has a majority, so we will not allow parliament to function. If this is a serious statement, then it is counter to all norms of constitutional ethics, morality and propriety. And for an opposition party to make a statement, and a leader especially, I think that I think he needs to rethink about his party's politics, because otherwise he'll be harming foundations of democracy itself and parliamentary system of government.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point I was earlier trying to make. By doing this, you willy-nilly you also put the other constitutional bodies on a higher pedestal than they should be.
Exactly. They say don't attack a constitutional authority, right? CAG is a constitutional authority. Don't say anything, though they've been doing it in the past in much, in terms which shouldn't even be repeated. But according to them, the Prime Minister is not a constitutional authority. The Prime Minister of India is a constitutional authority. So it's okay for them to attack the Prime Minister, but it's not okay for us to question the calculations of the CAG. What kind of logic is this? When it comes to their states, then the calculations of the CAG are hypothetical.
Sure.
CAG comments, expenditure in their states. When it comes to the center, then they are not hypothetical, they are real. So, I think that kind of double-faced politics, the people of India understand.
Mr. Sibal, many of the coal-bearing chief ministers, states chief ministers were opposing auctions. Now, do you think the constitutional bodies like the CAG or even the higher judiciary and others need to take this sentiment on board, because this is about the political economy, and This is not this is not something that the center can really address, is it?
I think the court should not be involved in issues of the opinions of state governments on matters of policy, right? Or what the CAG should do, should not do. The court is only concerned about the constitutional validity of a particular action. And I think the problem lies if you say, for example, that all allocations are bad, right? I mean, for example, take coal. At the moment, if all the allocations were to fructify, there would be generation of 32,000 megawatts of power. 1 megawatt costs 5 crores. So there would be, at the end of the day, an investment of 1,50,000 crores only in power, in the power sector. I'm not talking about steel, right? Of this 32,000 megawatts, the power purchase agreements with electricity boards which have already been entered into is for 10,000 megawatts, a little more than 10,000. If you were to multiply 5 crores to 10,000, it would be 50 crores. So the 50,000 crores worth of power purchase agreements have already been entered into. What does that mean? Which means investment has already been tied up. Whether it's foreign investment, loans from banks have been tied up.
That's a big concern. Banks are saying,
right. Ideally, what happens normally is that 30% of this investment comes from equity and about 70% from loans, which means 70% of the 50,000 crores are loans. Now, if you were to say cancel everything, which the BJP is saying before we have a discussion, then that means that all the banks will not be paid, right? All the investment that has come will be infructuous. Nobody will come into the sector anymore.
and this was the fear in telecom also.
But this has caused great harm, because you know the telecom sector is in deep trouble today. We are in debt for over about 2 lakh crores. So if a sector which was prosperous, we have through this process made it into a sector which is in debt. Is that good for the country? Is that good for the economy? You could have said, okay, this allocation is bad or that allocation is bad. But if you were to say everything is bad, then it has serious economic consequences which ultimately impact on the welfare state, impact on the future of the ordinary people in this country.
Sure.
If banks go down, where will be?
It will create a systemic crisis.
It's a systemic crisis today. The BJP is purposely not keeping this in mind when agitating, because they are actually digging the foundations. I mean, digging at the foundations of democracy and the whole and our economy. And if they destroy the economy, even if they will get some electoral verdict, which may to some extent favor them, what will they do with that? Because the economy would have been destroyed.
We'll discuss this in greater detail, but after a break, please don't go away. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Mr. Kapil Sibal. So you were talking about how in the telecom sector, because of this entire mess, costs have gone up, companies are up to their neck in debt, maybe cost to consumer will also go up, and there is a fear that the same thing could get repeated in coal, and the overall cost to the economy, which we had discussed when we opened this conversation, is there for everybody to see. But would you also blame the big business, the private sector, in partly creating this situation? Did they also not get overtaken by greed and?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you really talk of the telecom sector, they brought this crisis upon themselves.
They did, right?
They did, absolutely. Because what they did, see, those who had already had spectrum over the years because of legacy, did not want this spectrum to go to other new players.
Exactly.
Right? So when this was
the psychology of you got into the trains. And
therefore the fact of the matter is that there are one set of players who are who are, you know, like the Tendulkars in the cricket years. Another set of players who is like, you know,
lesser players.
No, people who have just come into the team, right? Who have got enormous talent, right? And they don't want all these guys there. So this whole issue about big loss, big loss, big loss, big loss, you know, and then the media picked it up and created a kind of atmosphere as if, you know, a whole loot had taken place, right? Now, fine, I mean, I think that, you know, we have to respect, you know, we have to respect the Supreme Court. We have to respect the Supreme Court, not because it is necessarily right, but because it is final, right? We've, you know, so we respect it. But the fact of the matter is the consequences of are horrendous. And we are seeing them in the telecom sector today. I'm trying very hard to set all that right. But it is really the industry, the greed of the industry, which led to all this. And it's really the greed of private entrepreneurs that sometimes they try and fix the system. And this will happen in individual cases. Even in coal, it might have happened. That individuals might have tried to fix by giving false information, you know, by exercising some kind of influence. All that may have happened. But it's really the greed that gets magnified into as if everybody is in the same game, and then somebody says, okay, I'll cancel everybody without realizing what the consequences of this are. You know, we are in a global economy, right, and we can't do without the global economy. If we don't get investments in, if we don't get the economic growth, I mean, our GDP back to 9%, we're going to be in deep trouble. And we have 15 or 20 or 25 years of opportunity. If we don't take this opportunity now, you know, we'll never get it again.
Sure. And especially in the case of telecom, it's all the more unfortunate because an industry which grew from 100 million subscribers to some 900 million in a matter of 7 years, and the world was hailing you, and that's when all this happens, where everything goes wrong.
No, but I think that after all, these are all matters which are sub judice, and the court will ultimately come to a conclusion, bow to the verdict of the court. All that is fine. But the fact of the matter is, we in government find it very difficult to tell a foreign investor, come and invest in this country. He says, you know, tomorrow somebody will cancel, what will I do? Why should I come? And so we have to give that confidence to the foreign investor, and we must tell our own industry, it's time for you to stop fighting. The growth story of India must be taken forward, and your individual greed should not come in the way. And that's something that the investor must also, entrepreneur must take care of. Take, for example, the whole concept of loss now, that the CAG is calculated, and see how he has calculated it. He takes in the coal, in the context of coal, the cost price of Coal India, right, of 1 ton of coal, and the sale price of that ton, averaged it out, and say the gain to Coal India is the gain to the private entrepreneurs, and conversely a loss to the exchequer, when he knows that this coal cannot be sold. How do you compare an entity which sells coal with an entity which cannot sell coal? And then calculate.
Because those are captive.
This is to be used captively, coal to be used captively for power generation, which the
power
rates are regulated, tariffs are controlled, and for manufacture of steel, which is also subject to international market pricing. So, I mean, this is just completely unbelievable.
So, even Mr. Sibal, at this stage, do you think some correctives can be taken, at least in the case of coal, and people can be assured that, okay, this coal is going into power which will be regulated and sold within a certain band of pricing, you know?
No, that is the law. There will be competitive bidding for lowest tariff, and the power plant will be granted to that entity. Who offers the lowest tariff, because that unit of electricity has to be sold to the board. And if he makes too much of a profit even there, you have under the Electricity Act a regulatory mechanism. It will be further controlled. So there is no worry on that count. As the steel sector is concerned, you know, it goes through cyclical phases where every 3-4 years the steel sector makes losses or gains, as the case may be. And therefore, this input again is meant for the manufacture of steel. See, the cost of transactions in India are far higher than the cost of transactions outside India. So Indian steel manufacturers are not competitive abroad in many ways. I mean, your interest rate is 14%. In America, it's 0.25. So and other costs are much greater in India. At the same time, some costs are much lower. So the industry tries very hard to be competitive. And if you're going to have auctions at every stage, you're going to make the industry, even more non-competitive.
So the government, so you're suggesting that the government at this moment is determined not to do any unblock cancellation of these coal blocks. And you'll just go by each case on merit.
Interministerial group is sitting, and they will decide on each case, if at all, there's something that is wrong.
The BJP seemed to give the impression that if some judicial inquiry is set up, they would be back to Parliament.
Judicial inquiry for what? As if some wrong has been committed. But the government, remember they said, Mr. Jaitley said, why don't they borrow the leaf out of Mr. Vajpayee when he was Prime Minister? At the time when petrol pump, they cancelled. But see what happened. Supreme Court struck it down, saying you should never have cancelled the petrol pumps. It was a mindless, thoughtless act. And, we are not prepared to be mindless and thoughtless. If they had been, that was their privilege.
But Mr. Sibal, in this, there was a screening committee where state government representatives were there, centre. But it also now transpires that routinely leaders were giving recommendations. Now, there was nothing wrong. Now, retrospectively, people are saying that those recommendations were being very transparently being given, is it?
See, recommendations were being given by everybody. You had the Punjab Chief Minister do it, you had Orissa Chief Minister do it, you had the Chhattisgarh, you had from West Bengal there came a letter, Rajasthan there came a, so all those things were happening. But the fact of the matter is the screening committee will still have to give reasons as to why they decided in a particular case. If the reasons are arbitrary, they'll come to the fore. But no government can function without discretion.
Yeah, sure.
In Australia, for example, it is the minister who grants a mine.
And what is your sense of all the blocks that have been given, 57 blocks which CAG has examined, and over 30 are in the no-go area, and is there any evidence of squatting? Are people squatting for valuation purposes?
Even the CAG report says that takes about 4 years to, for the CIL, 4.5 years. The CIL takes 4 years to set up a mine, right? To set up a power plant takes 4.5 years. You have to find out where the coal is, you have to find out the quality of the coal, you have to have a mining plan, you have to have a railway siding, you have to have transportation facilities, you have all that. Coal has to be washed. Depending on...
So you're saying there isn't much evidence of squatting by companies?
I am not, I do not know because I'm not the appropriate authority. Okay. But if there is any issue of squatting, because we have cancelled 26 coal blocks which had been given in the past.
Some notices were given even before the CAG report, right?
We had cancelled. So much before the CAG report, we had started cancelling, right? And if we find that somebody has squatted and his interest is not in mining at all, his interest is in squatting, I'm sure they'll give us advice.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks for talking to us, Mr. Sibal. That's all we have in this episode of State of the Economy. We'll be back soon. Thank you.